It's Nick and Neil's Summer Millwall History Show.
Hello, dear listener, Neil here. A very warm welcome to Nick and Neil's History Show and our Millwall Summer Specials. The aim of Nick and myself is to build a library of 20, 25-minute shows you can dip in and out of in the car, in the gym or on the train, anywhere you like, really. This is proper history, lots of unbelievable stories that we should know but don't. So here we are, rescuing these stories from obscurity and breathing new life into them. Nick and I feel that as a club, we don't make the most of our rich history, and it's a subject that is often ignored. And we hope this series will bring to life some of the events and characters of our past. It's been a real pleasure to research this series, and I hope you enjoy listening to them as much as we have enjoyed making them. Enjoy.
It's Nick and Neil's Summer Millwall History Show.
Neil, this is a wonderful story that you found, illustrating a very difficult period in our national history. I've read about this online previously, but you've really dug out some info that backs what I would have thought were just internet stories. This is the refusal of Millwall Football Club in the late 1940s, just after the end of the Second World War, the refusal of Millwall Football Club to allow German prisoners of war to attend football matches at Coldblow Lane. Wonderful, wonderful reporting you found here.
Mate, it was quite by accident. I was looking into the life of Jack Cock.
Yeah.
And went on to the Daily Mail archive, typed in Jack Cock, and you come across all sorts. And then towards the bottom, just before he left Millwall, I think, which was in 1948, there was this story. So I opened it up, and it was actually on the Daily Mail front page. It was around, and it's this story that Millwall Football Club have decided to refuse German prisoners of war admission to their ground in the forthcoming season. So immediately my spidey senses automatically.
Absolutely.
And I start thinking, oh, yeah, but this is a good story. This will make a wonderful podcast.
Your reporting instincts take over, Neil. I mean, that's a wonderful, wonderful story. I mean, just to set the scene for listeners, obviously, the report that you found dated July 1947. So the Second World War ended in Europe 2 years beforehand. In the post-war period, there were very many German prisoners of war still in the UK. I think they would be sent home gradually. Some chose to stay, interestingly, which probably is a subject of a different podcast. But they were used as kind of labouring. They were put to work, Neil, weren't they, in post-war shattered Britain and London, made to try and put right some of the damage that the German state had caused in the 6 years of conflict.
Yeah, I think a lot of it was to do with denazification. And they wanted to make sure that these people were safe to return to Germany.
Yeah.
I would have thought so. So they and probably the sheer number of German POWs that we had over here, especially towards the end of the war, when we were capturing large swathes of France,
they were surrendering, weren't they? Yeah,
all over Europe, and that I've listened to various podcasts on the subject that we didn't want too many over here because we were already rationing.
Yeah, life was tough, very tough.
And we couldn't afford. Yeah, we couldn't afford basically to feed them. There was plenty of land, so we were going through that process at the end of World War II of who was safe to go back to Germany. You didn't want to send somebody back that was too dangerous. So I think they're around in this country for 2 or 3 years after the war, and they just lifted restrictions in July 1947, which this actually came about. I know that West Ham during World War II welcomed German POWs into the ground, and there's actually a picture doing the rounds. I think it's on Getty. If you have a look,
I think I've seen it on the net. Yeah,
of German prisoners of war enjoying a day out at Upton Park to watch.
welcome to Upton Park, but not down Coldblow Lane, Neil, as this piece from the Daily Mail clearly shows. This is a wonderful quote. It's from our manager of the time, listeners, Jack Cock. The proposition has been put, I'm going to presume this was from the FA or the London authorities, to allow German prisoners of war admission to the den as a kind of like a R&R type of thing, a bit of rest and recuperation. But Jack Cock's riposte, Neil, is wonderful, and I'm going to give it the best dramatic delivery that I can, listeners, in memory of Jack, because I think he does a good job with this. So his reply is, quote, "With loathing and detestation, we absolutely point blank refuse the countenance, the suggestion. This ground has been severely hit by the enemy's attention, causing us great financial worry. It's not our desire to see a series of free fights at every match, which would certainly happen if we allowed these men into the ground." I think that's one end quote. I mean, Jack knew his club. A bunch of German POWs set loose in the den, Neil, with hard-faced dockers.
Yeah, well, just to
say hello.
Just to set the scene was that German POWs at the time were allowed to enter shops, travel on buses and trams, but couldn't drink in a hotel, which is another name of a pub, and they could attend football matches. And the government wanted to encourage the spending of earnings in this country instead of remaining as credits when they returned to Germany. Basically, you're reading stuff. The country's skint.
Yeah. Millwall skint.
Yeah. What we want is we don't want these people returning home with plenty of money in their pockets, rebuilding the German economy. So we'll read between the lines there. But it wasn't a... Yeah, you have to remember in historical context that Millwall fans were probably quite right to still be slightly annoyed.
Well, absolutely.
Because the Docks had received a lot of attention, especially in the early days of the war. I think the first night of the Blitz, the Surrey dock fire on the 7th September 1940.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, Neil's listed on the show notes, listeners, a series of major events during the course of the war. I mean, the Surrey docks obviously were, the whole London docks were, and other docks across the country were massive targets during certainly the early phase of the war. Most famously, September the 7th, 1940. There's a plaque on the side of as you drive into the shopping centre from the tunnel end. There's a building there, one of the old dock offices, with a plaque on the wall, listeners, which commemorates the opening night of what became known as the Blitzkrieg. A huge firebomb raid on the docks. Many families would have lost people. My own family lost an aunt on that first night. She was caught in the open when and it was also early in the war, Neil. I think people weren't yet used to the what should we call it? The rhythm, the discipline, the just what happens in a major air raid. I think people got used to it after a fashion, but people were caught, and this was the first night of it, and it continued. It continued on certainly for 1940-41, and then made a kind of a comeback later in the war. There was a smaller second, what I call a second blitz, late in the war, as Germany was starting to lose the conflict. And then, of course, the V2 rocket hits, including tragically, famously, infamously, the Woolworths at New Cross. It was a direct hit from a V2 rocket, killing hundreds. We were an area that suffered hard at the hands of the Germans, so in modern parlance, it was a somewhat insensitive request, wasn't it? To allow a bunch of Germans loose in our football ground.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure. Yeah, it's I think 168 killed, and there
Yeah,
were babies and children, and there were an awful lot hurt. In fact, it was actually one of the worst losses of civilian life on British soil during World War II. So you can understand that people were still were still upset. And don't forget, to a certain extent, the Nuremberg war trials had shone.
yeah. The truth was coming out
Yeah.
about the nature of the regime in
So
in
people
Germany.
were very anti-German. I don't know if people have seen The Goalkeeper, which is the Bert Trankman story. German POW played for Manchester City, broke his
Seen
neck.
it, good film. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, excellent film, and that kind of captures how people were anti Germans for a lot of years, weren't they, after World War II?
Well, they
But
were. Yeah,
I think this request or this law came around. It was actually quite a good bit of publicity, or a good idea by Jack Cock. I think that Millwall had latched onto it and spoke out. This was in the days before social media, podcasting.
yeah.
Uh,
He caught the moment, didn't
yeah,
he? I mean, I'm just looking at some of the notes that you've got. I mean, you've said already that German prisoners of war were allowed to enter shops, travel on buses and trams, but Millwall were not alone in protesting this. I see here that the London conductors and
flipping.
drivers,
Yeah,
protested against having to carry German POWs on their buses. Several garages, London passenger travel board garages, complained to their union branches, refusing to carry them. In Bristol, cinemas announced they would not allow prisoners of war in. And similar decisions across the country, Hymes Park, Chingford, Bridgend. And the Bristol tramways actually refused to. They were also consulting camp commandants following complaints from members of the public that Germans are on the last buses out of Bristol. So we caught a mood, I think would be a good way to put it. We reflected widespread public opinion.
yeah. It was obviously a big thing, and there was a big thing against it. And funnily enough, I was looking for a follow-up to this story, but couldn't find one, so I presume that they remain banned. But it wasn't a universally popular decision, as H. Mills of SW11 wrote
Yes.
for the Daily Mail saying, I, with others, will not be travelling to the Millwall ground until this unsportsmanlike attitude to defeat to a defeated enemy is abandoned. Yeah, well, I'm not sure if H. Mills actually came to the Den that often.
H. Mills would have got slaughtered on Millwall Twitter for that, wouldn't he? Can you imagine?
Yeah, but they got cancelled for trying to cancel Millwall. They were trying to cancel the Germans.
He would have been thrown off the House of Fun website, I can tell you, coming out with that kind of talk. And they were. I mean, the punchline being, of course, that as we've said at the start of the show, listeners, that Upton Park, West Ham did allow them to enter the ground. West Ham playing Bradford, and these Germans were allowed out because of their good behaviour. So they'd proven that they were trustees and they're allowed to go to football.
Killed anyone that week? Haven't committed any atrocities that week. You can go to the football.
Haven't they suffered enough being allowed to go to West Ham? Will be my reaction. Wonderful story. I mean, I think these. You can see both sides of it, and the idea that we're trying to get the economy going, that these German workers, POW workers, had money in their pockets and they wanted to get it off them, in a nutshell. I get that. I think there's something quite noble and uplifting. And, even now, after the passage of, 1947, so we're talking about 70 odd years ago, 80 years ago, I feel quite proud of our club for this stance, Neil. I'm hoping it's still in place. Actually, it might be like one of those laws that never gets struck off the statute book, like the right to fire archery on Tower Hill or something on a Sunday, something like that. It's still in place. I'm hoping, anyway.
Yeah, that if you're a former Nazi POW, you can't come into the new Den. I think that what we're forgetting also, or that we ought to need to remind people of, was Millwall were quite badly hit during World War II.
We were, yeah.
In a Den which was all singing and all dancing in 1938-39 that we just had the ground improved ahead of a push towards the First Division.
Yep.
And was actually hit by a bomb in World War II, and the ground had burnt down, isn't it? The stand had burnt down after an amateur or London.
Yeah.
Game.
There is a very Millwall twist to that story, isn't there? I mean, you're right. The old den, for anyone that attended the old den, it lowered in one corner, which would be where there was a railway line once upon a time that ran across the kind of the cut of the corner on the, would that be the Alderton Road end there. And the bomb landed there, and there used to be a clock apparently on that corner when the floodlights used to be. And there's a famous photo, Neil. You've probably seen it. It was in Lines of the South of the impact, post explosion impact, a kind of crater with half the stand gone, basically. Bizarrely, a football match still being played whilst people stood on the cratered terracing and perched on whether the rubble was reasonably solid to get a view of the game. But it was a huge bomb blast. Massive bomb took out a good corner of the ground and half the what I would still call the halfway line stand, pretty badly damaged. But the pride and joy of the old ground, the old Coldblow Lane, was the main stand, which, as you've said, Neil, was built for First Division football, potentially just before the Second World War broke out. But unfortunately, it has a far less dramatic ending. It did go up in flames, but that was more. Hitler couldn't do it, but a cast-off cigarette could. In very Millwall fashion, it wasn't the most evil regime in human history that did it. It was someone chucking away a fag.
The Dulwich Hamlet fan.
Burned it down. Caught a load of... No one cleared the rubbish.
Yeah, and the club were also refused permission, of course, by the Ministry of Labour to actually repair the damage because there just wasn't the labour around.
No, and material. I think there were shortages of labour and materials. And what is interesting, I mean, the story we're talking about is set in 1947 and the refusal of the Germans to come into the den. When you see photos of the ground at that point, it was still pretty much largely unrepaired. I mean, the old roof stand on the halfway line, still shattered at this point because, as we said, rationing, resources, shortages, austerity. The club was still reeling from the effects of a conflict that probably took a long time. It wasn't really until the construction of the new den we entirely shook off the after effects of this period. So I think we're entitled to be a bit embittered about the idea of letting a bunch of Germans into our ground. And what I'm going to do to conclude the episode, listeners, I'm going to reread Jack's quote because I just love it, Neil. With loathing and detestation, we absolutely point blank refuse to countenance the suggestion. This ground has been severely hit by the enemy's attention, causing us great financial worry. It's not our desire to see a series of free fights every match, which would certainly happen if we allowed these men in the ground. Wonderful quote, Jack Cock. Thank you very much, Neil, for finding this wonderful, wonderful story.
It's Nick and Neil's Summer Millwall History Show.